everybody. So, does your child's addiction leave you with more questions than answers? Like, of course it does, right? That's how I used to feel all of the time. And that's one of the reasons I created my podcast called Living with Addiction. My name is Heather Ross, and I'm the host of the podcast. And the purpose of creating that podcast was to give parents who are struggling because of their child's addiction either actionable steps that they could take away from each episode to help themselves and their child, or new information that they could use to form your own beliefs about addiction and leave with a sense of a new empowerment that you didn't have before, so you don't have to live at the mercy of your child's addiction. And once you're able to start taking ownership and researching and understanding their addiction and understanding how best to support them in a way that really aligns with who you want to be as a parent, and understanding how to support yourself, it totally changes your experience of your child's addiction. I went through so much pain, and I went through it feeling so alone because I just didn't know what to do. I was totally overwhelmed by it until I took ownership in the situation, until I started really researching addiction, finding things that really resonated with me, figuring out the best way to support my daughter instead of trying to control her, which only pushed her away from me. And so that was the whole purpose of creating this podcast, is to help you on that same journey, to help get you started so you can start figuring out what works for you and your family. So on my latest podcast episode, I had my first guest. Her name is Gill, and she is the host of the Sober Powered podcast. She's 14 months sober, and her podcast is focused on the science and psychology of addiction. And so, of course, she's like the perfect fit for me to have as a guest on the Living with Addiction podcast. And we talked about some really helpful topics. And some of the things that we went over were alcohol in the teen brain, and how starting drinking at an early age affects their brain development. We also talked about rock bottom and how it looks different for each person. We often hear a lot of horror stories about how, rock bottom, our kids have to hit rock bottom before they're going to decide to get sober. And that was a huge fear of mine as I was watching things change in my daughter's life and wondering how bad it was going to have to get. And so when she decided to go to rehab, it was honestly a surprise to me because of that belief that it had to be so bad before she would want to get sober, which honestly, that belief really caused me a lot of additional pain, a lot of fear of what was going to happen in the future before she did hit rock bottom. So we talk about that. And then we also talked about like why consequences aren't enough. And it's maddening as a parent to watch your child going down this road with their addiction and experiencing all of these consequences, but not stopping. And we talked a little bit more about like how endorphins and positive expectancies, which she also explains what positive expectancies are in the episode, how they play into a person's decision to continue drinking or not, and how that drives them to. And we talked about a lot of other things, but I just wanted to give you a few ideas of what you would take away, what you would learn if you listen to this podcast. And I highly recommend it because you don't have to go through this alone. And just taking the time, a little bit of time each day, like my episodes are 15 to 30 minutes long, will really help you over time gain new perspective on what you're dealing with. And that new perspective is going to totally shape how you experience your child's addiction, the quality of your life while you're going through this. You don't have to be at the mercy of waiting for your child to change, waiting for them to get sober for you to feel better. There are things that you can do to help yourself along the way. And that's what my podcast is about. That's what I focus on, giving you things that you can take away from each episode. So you can look up the Living with Addiction podcast on iTunes or Spotify. It's on pretty much every major podcast platform. Or you can go to my website, heatherrosscoaching.com, and there is a podcast link on there. And then anytime you have questions or anything after you listen to an episode, just reach out to me. I'll be happy to answer them.